This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, Agon Erev Shabbos Rabbi Say, we're going to continue in our series on Tefilla, sponsored by Rabbi Tzalel Rose. Lezecher Nishmas, his brother Tzvi ben Levi Yitzchak, Neshama Shav and Aliyah. We thank him for sponsoring this series for Tavshin Pei. Okay, so we are, for now, finished with the Birchas HaShachar. When I say finished, obviously, the Torah is endless, and everything that our Anshe Knesset Hagdolah were masakin based on Tefillah, masakin in our Tefillah is endless, and we could try to mine the gold that exists in the Tefillah endlessly, but we're going to move on for now to the next part of davening, to the Korbanos. And we're going to speak a little bit about perhaps the most important Korbanos to say. In other words, as we mentioned the other day, it's very important to have a clear knowledge of the hierarchy of Tefillah. And because most places the davening is, faster than you could really chew. And really the objective is supposed to be to start Shemona Esrei with the Tzibur. And now, one always has to say all the Birchas HaShachar. Certainly one should do his utmost to say the entire Psukei de Zimra. It's very important to say the whole Psukei de Zimra. Every part of Psukei de Zimra is critical, and it's a flow one from the next. However, if saying the whole Psukei de Zimra will not allow you to daven Shemona Esrei with the Tzibur, of course there are parts that need to be skipped. Now one should not do that regularly. In other words, one should make sure to come early enough to be able to say the whole Psukei de Zimra. But sometimes you find yourself, for whatever reason, a person, if you come exactly on time, you'll probably still have to skip. But for whatever reason a person has to skip, you need to know, the bare minimum is Baruch Sha'amar, Ashrei Yishtabach, and if you could say more, you should say all the Halalukas. But, and of course you have to say Birchas HaShachar. Ma Toivu Adon Olam, these are all beautiful, but if it's going to delay you keeping up with the Tzibur, you have to skip that. But Korbanos is also a very important part of davening. There is a shita, I believe Rabbi Avram min Hahar, that Korbanos are da'iraisa. Because Hashem came to Avram Avinu, and Avram Avinu said, Rebbeinu Shalom, how do I know I'm going to inherit Eretz Yisrael? And Hashem said, Kachali egla mishulashes, v'ayel mishulashes. Kachali egla mishulashes. In other words, the Korbanos will ensure you'll inherit Eretz Yisrael. And Avram says, very nice when the Beis HaMikdash is standing. But what about when the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed? And Hashem said, by the recitation of Korbanos, that will ensure your ability to stay in Eretz Yisrael. So according to Rabbi Avram min Nahar, the recitation of Korbanos is somewhat biblical. Now, what Korbanos do you need to say? We're gonna see today that of all the Korbanos, perhaps the most important to say is the Parashat Hatamid. After all, the whole Tefillah Shachris is enacted corresponding to the Parashat Hatamid. So, I don't know, somebody told me when I was in yeshiva a long time ago that you should say the Parashat Hatamid. So I think that's an important thing to do at the very minimal. Just the Parashat Hatamid probably takes about a minute. But what is the tachlis of saying Korbanos before davening? After all, davening we're praising Hashem. What is the purpose of the recitation of Korbanos? So the Netziv, in his commentary to Shiur Hashirim, he says, Ikar tachlis hakarban sha'oila l'ratzin l'makriva hu shetishma utiskabel tfilasa ba'isasha. The main purpose of Korbanos in engendering goodwill from God is, it's not just, Hashem wants a barbecue, so let's grill him, a whole cow. No, the purpose of Korbanos is to gain goodwill from Hashem in order to get your tefillah answered. The purpose of Korbanos is a way of gaining Ratzain in order to have your tefillas niskabel. The Gam HaMakrivim HaRishonim, Kain and Hevel, even the very first offerers of Korbanos, Kain and Hevel, that they brought their Korbanos was in order to have their tefillos answered for success. In other words, they wanted to be successful either in the linen industry or in the wool industry, and they brought a carbon. That's what it means. God turned to Hevel and to his carbon. What does it mean, God turned to Hevel and to his carbon? It should say, Vayisha Hashem El Minchas Hevel. What's El Hevel v'El Minchase? El Hevel means to his prayer, which is the soul of a person. Like Chana said, I'm going to pour my soul before God. So that's what it means. God turned to Hevel, that's Hevel's prayer, and to his carbon. And even at the time of the Hakravas Hatamidim, which was the bread of Klal Yisrael, was in order to have the prayers of the Anshe Maimed accepted, like we say in Tainus. So now we tend to think, prayer is in lieu of Korbanos. The real thing is Korbanos and prayer is in lieu of Korbanos. No, just the opposite. The function of Korbanos was to get your prayer answered. It's just we don't have Korbanos today, so we sort of have to rely on prayer both to have it answered and as a way of gaining ratzon from Hashem. In the Yerushalmi it brings the whole congregation bowed down. This refers to Klal Yisrael. Now, hashtachava is tefillah, like it says in Saita, ein tefillah seishal adam neshmas, unless you make yourself like flesh. Shenemar kol yavoy kol basar lehishtachavos. So bowing is tefillah. V'chein kol yachid k'shayrotcha tekuval tefillasei, a makar of karmas ba'al olav. Even individuals, when they wanted to offer a prayer, they would bring a carbon and then they would pray. Like it says in Tehillim, L'cha, to you, Dumia Tehillah, your praise is silence, Elokim b'tzion, U'lecha yeshulam neder, to you I will pay back my vow. So even David says in the context of his prayer that he's going to bring a carbon. Why? Because afterwards in the next pasuk, after he says that I'm going to bring my carbon, Shoymea Tefillah Adecha Kabasar Yavayu. So there are many proofs that Korbanos accompanied prayer. It was a way of gaining ratzon toward your prayer. The reason for this is Korbanos hayamaratzim es ha'adam. Korbanos would gain appeasement, would allow a person to be gain favor. And atone for one's sins. We know that sin is a iron wall between us and God. Even a carbon oila and a carbon shlomim. Garnered ritzoy, like it says in Erechin, afal pi she'ein miskaper loy ad she'yisratze. Even though we don't get kapara until we're appeased. So the way Korbanos work is, it would be meratze a person, mechaper on one's avoinos, and through this, it allowed one's tefillos to be answered. And sekshenis, another important facet of Korbanos is hayogorim lebal of ava dvekos kuchabricho. It would cause the owner of the carbon, it would cause him to love and to cling to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It would engender love. And when somebody loves Hashem, that's also a powerful way to get your tefillos answered. V'zem moyel harbe letefillah. This is very beneficial for tefillah. Kedachsiv li'ava es Hashem ula avdoi b'chol lavavchem. So we see that avas Hashem is the introduction and the mavoi and the foundation of davening. We learned in the beginning of Tainus, what is avodah shabalev? Let me just move this. Oh. What is avodah shabalev? This is tefillah. And right next to it is avas Hashem. And therefore Chazal were Misakein, we're soymech gula latfila. Does anybody know why do we say Shema right before Shemana Esrei? Because since Shema has the mitzvah of Avas Hashem, therefore that is the great introduction to Tefillah. You ever realize that? That the reason why Shema is the introduction to Shemana Esrei is because in Shema we have the mitzvah of Avas Hashem, and that serves as the great intro to prayer. As we know, in the time of Kriya Shema, it's a mitzvah to think about Avas Hashem, and that's the mashal that Rashi gives in Brachas in the name of Yushalmi. Remember, Rashi says, why do we have to be Samech Gulula Tefillah? It's like someone who knocks on the king's door, and the king says, what do you want? You better ask, because if you say, oh, never mind, I just wanted to see if you would answer the door, that's a chutzpah noira. So if you knock on the king's door, you better answer it. But the mashal Rashi gives is, it's a mashal to someone who is the friend, someone who loves the king. And this is all the inyan of Korbanos when the Beis HaMikdash stood. So Marav Rabbi say, a question we have to ask ourselves is, I don't know, at least in the yeshiva that I went to, Shachris would start at 7:30, Mizmar Shir Chanukas Habayis L'David. So Berachas, what happened to Korbanos? Do people say Korbanos? And even if people say Korbanos, Balabatim say Korbanos, do Bnei Yeshiva say Korbanos? Often not. So how could that be? Is there any rationale for that? Is there any justification for that? So we go to Shalas Tshuvas Chikrei Lev. If you bear with me for a moment, and I'm not sure this is a good idea what I'm about to do. Who wrote the Chikrei Lev? Let me see if I could find. Okay, good, I still have it. The Chikrei Lev was written by Rabbi Rafal Yosef Chazan, one of the classic Sephardic poskim. Rabbi Vadia would quote him a lot. He says, He says, isn't it strange that most Tamir Chachamim, they don't say Korbanos, but they also need kapara. Everyone sins. If based on the Gemara, we find that Hashem is saying that I was masakein Korbanos for Klal Yisrael, and the Orchos Chaim and the Torah Shulchan Aruch say that you have to do it. How could we not be concerned to say Korbanos? Now, he says, even though I saw in the Sefer Eliyah Rabbah in the name of the Lechem Chamudayis, that someone who's able to learn, it's better to learn than just to say things in the Siddur. This is not clear. Because at the end of Menachos we find there's a man de Amar. Someone who learns Torah doesn't need an oila and a chatos, because Talmud Torah is mechaper avanoseinu. And according to this, you have to say that when Rabbi Yitzchak says afterwards, Kala oisek b'taras chatos, it's as if you learn chatos. He argues and he holds that you dafka have to say the Parashat of Korbanos. And it seems like the Repaskins this way, because he says, Ha'oiskim b'toiras avoida, anyone who learns Korbanos, it's like the Beis HaMikdash was built. That implies even Talmidei Chachamim need to say the Korbanos. And from the fact that the Gemara in Tainus says that when Avram Avinu wanted to know how could he be confident to get into Eretz Yisrael, Hashem didn't say, okay, because Talmidei Chachamim are going to learn Nashim and Nazikim. Hashem said because they're going to say Parshas of Korbanos. Even though we say in Brachos Talmud Torah Mechaperes, and we have a Gemara, it's not Mechaper with Korbanos, but rather B'Torah G'mils Chasadim. But maybe what that means is Kodshim is Torah. Especially according to the Ramint, Maharimet, and his Drashos, and the Marsha, that when the Prophet says, Kaloisik B'Torah Ein Tzarech Oila, that is, Torah protects you that you don't come to sin. But if you did sin, then Avada, you need to say Korbanos. So what's the Eitzah? In other words, there are a lot of B'nai Torah, and they spend a lot of time learning, and they don't say Korbanos, so he says like this, Ki al kol eila yonirli limtza tikkun lazeh. You ready? This is a trick. I always like to give tricks. Shelo yizbatel milimudai b'kris Korbanos. You don't have to be mevatel from your learning by saying Korbanos, and you could have your cake and eat it. You could get the kapara of Korbanos, but you don't have to actually say it. And that is as follows. You say the following Yehiratzain. V'hainu im yoymar Yehiratzain Sheyiyah merutza lefanecha kilu ikravnu kol hakarbonos kaparasenu kakaz v'sarsecha kol hakarbonos kulam. You say, God, it should be your will, as if I brought all the korbanos that it says in your Torah. So basically you say, God, I wish I could do it. Okay, now we're ready to go. So you learn your Daf Yomi, you learn your Mishnah Yomis, obviously Daf HaShavua, and you could take out all the learning you want. I Korbanos, Yehiratzain, that I wish I could have done it. So you say, what do you mean that's a cop-out? Sharei Kaimalan, we paskin, that at the end of Rosh Hashanah, that you don't have to say the Korbanos of Musaf on Rosh Hashanah, you could just say Kakosa b'Sayrasecha. So just like in the Shemona Esrei, you could just say, we want to bring your Korbanos like it says in your Torah, and that bails you out. So 2 a.m, you don't have to actually read all the Korbanos. Just say, God, this should be as if I brought all the Korbanos. Pirish Rashi, Ein Tzarich Loimer Mikrois HaMusafim. You don't have to say the Psukim of Musaf. V'avshat Tosfos Sham Cholko Alav. Even though Tosfos argues the Mikrois Sham Moshe B'Magnar Tzarich Laskil Olam, that the Korbanos in the place of the that the Psukim you do need to say. But the Rush writes that many argue on Rabbeinu Tam, because if Kakosav b'Sarasecha works for Machia Zechronos and Shafaros, certainly for Psukei Musaf, that if you say Kakosav b'Sarasecha, it's like you said them. V'chein das Rov HaPoskim. In other words, the Rush says that if technically you didn't say Machia Zechronos and Shafaros, you just say, God, you're the king, like it says in your Torah. See there, God, I wish I could bring all the Korbanos it says in the Torah. What does it say? The Torah is on the it's in the Aron Kodesh. Check it out. Your Yotzei for Machia Zechron Shafaris. Your Yotzei for the Korbanos of Musaf. Says the Chikrei Lev, you should be Yotzei for Korbanos, and the Shulchan Aruch paskins this way in Siman Tav Kov Tzadik Aleph. He does. Let's check this out. The Ramah says, the Mechaber says, you want to say more than 10 psukim? Say more than 10 psukim. Says Ramah, miuim lo hischal b'shum pasuk. Let's say you didn't say any of the psukim of Malchia Zechron Shavaris. Rak Omar uv'seirascha kasav leimar yatsa. You like that? I know there's a lot of talk. How are we going to daven Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? It's not going to be safe to be in shul for so long. So I already heard one of the biggest poskim in America said Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, either they're going to make a Hoicha Shmona Esrei, or they're going to skip all the piyutim. No v'chol ma'aminim, no Nusana Toikef, no Lekel Erech Din. I heard this. I'm not saying we're going to do this, but this is, So I have a new Eitzah. You could skip basically half the Shmona Esrei of Malchia Zechron Shabaros.
You could discount the tickets.
Yeah, no, just the opposite. This is going to cost much more. If you want to come to my shul, starting 9 o'clock, you'll be out.
9 o'clock and finish at 11.
Ata nigleis abanan kvoidecha kakosu b'soyrosecha baruch ata. Right? That's what the Ramah paskins. Can you imagine? And you know how much time the Chazan gurgles on Vinemar. Every Vinemar is a few seconds. You just got rid of 10 Vinemars. So that's how the Ramah paskins. So it says the Chikrei Lev, if you don't need to say Malchia Zechron Shabaros, you don't have to say Korbanos. I see some people are really smiling and getting excited. By the way, this was a joke. I'm not that serious. But V'chein minagenu she'ein anu maskirim psukei karbon ki im b'Shabbos. We don't say the Korbanos of a lot of the Musafim. Only on Shabbos we say, and Rosh Chodesh. But Yom Tov and Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we rely on Kakaz B'Sarasecha. I didn't realize that, by the way. It's a good thing I came today. I didn't know that on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur we don't say the psukim of Musaf. We just say Kakaz B'Sarasecha. Only on Yom Tov and Rosh Hashanah, only Shabbos and Yom Tov, we're accustomed to those psukim. So says the Chikrei Lev, Nira de Gamkein Talmid Chacham, who doesn't want to be mavatel his learning, he could follow this to be yotzei midei safek. The Gemara says in Tainus, that bisman that you're koirei the Korbanos, it appears that you need a kriya gemura to be mechaper. He says, what does that stand for? Haloi. It should say, I think he's trying to say this is not a question. Because even by Malchia Zechroinais, it says you need to say 10 psukim. But the Rishonim say you only need to say 10 psukim. If you say one pasuk, you better say 10. But if you want, you don't have to say any. You could pater yourself with Kakaz B'Sarasecha, then you're kailol all of them. Here too, when we say that you need to say Korbanos, that's if you want to say them. Once you started saying them, but someone who is not rugil to say them, at the very least, you're allowed to use the following trick. God, I wish I could say the Korbanos. It should be considered, like I said, all the Korbanos in your Torah. That's a good trick, okay? Definitely you owe me one. So, if let's say one day, I'm not saying you should do this, but if let's say one day you're running late and you don't have time to say all the Korbanos, so then just whip out this good, the good old Yehi Ratzain, and you're good to go. Now we have a very interesting question. I do admit I never thought of this question. We know in the carbon of the Tefilla of Musaf, in Musaf we say the psukim of Musaf. On Yom Tov we say the psukim of Korbanos that were brought on Yom Tov. On Rosh Chodesh we say, the psukim of the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh. So Tefillah Shachris, which was enacted Keneged the carbon Tamid, why do we not say Parshas Hatamid in Shemona Esrei? Isn't that a good question? Yeah, I knew you would like that question. I'm saying I see so many smiles. I even see someone who's smiling. They haven't stopped smiling since the shiur started. Maybe because that's the picture that's frozen. Oh. I'm joking. Huh? It's okay. Anyway, so this is the kasha of the Noid Yehuda. The Noid Yehuda wants to know about Shabbadak Lan Ma'alosai Lama Psukei Musafim Kabul to Asamuz Barashat Tam Lo Tikn Lam Psukei Hatamid. Why do we not say the psukim of Tamid in Shemona Esrei? By the way, the Torah writes they were koivea to read Parshas Hatamid, like we find in the Medrash that Hashem said, "Bizman shein Beis Hamikdash Kayam," I gave them the seder of Korbanos. So it sounds like the way we are yotzei Korbanos, at the very least, is the recitation of the Tamid. So why do we not recite the Tamid in Shachris? So says the holy Noid Yehuda. Really, I shouldn't answer. Because do you know who made Shemona Esrei? Anshe Knesset Agdola, prophets, Nevi'im. They knew the great secrets of how to access the gateways of heaven. For us to conjecture exactly why they did things is really not correct, and we don't understand what the mechanism they use. But nevertheless, as Noid Yehuda al Pi Pshat, it would seem the following great reason why we don't say the Parashas Hatamid in Shemona Esrei. Ready for this? Says the Noid Yehuda, because the Tefillos were enacted to be an expression of all of man's needs. And anybody in a time of need could raise his hands to the heaven to daven Shemona Esrei. How many times a day are you allowed to daven Shemona Esrei? Technically, you could daven all day long. The Gemara says, Halavai, sheispalu kol hayom kulai, halavai, you should daven the entire day. And even according to the dissenting view, if you have, let's say, a difficulty or something new you need to pray for, you're allowed to daven a second Shacharis or a second Mincha or a seventh Shachris. You're allowed to daven if you have something new to add and to cry out for. You're allowed to daven Shemona Esrei again. Shemona Esrei is the expression of the full gamut of man's needs. Now, if you're going to say the Parashat Hatamid in Shemona Esrei, then all you would be able to daven is once Shachris and once Mincha. And let's say somebody would have a certain Sarah, he wouldn't be able to daven again, because what's he saying the Parashat Hatamid for? Meaning we're allowed to daven the Shemona Esrei more than once, because the Shemona Esrei is always relevant all day long. We always need refuah, we always need parnasa, we always need Yerushalayim. They are the constant needs of man. But imagine somebody who had a particular need. He already brought the Tamid, he can't say it again. And so you'll say, well, make up your own nusach. We can't rely on someone to make up their own nusach. Elamai, to make another nusach besides Shachris and Mincha for those who want to add something. They didn't want to bother with that. They don't want to bother people. So even though our Tefilla is keneged the Tamid, they did not make a zikara into the Tamid beferish b'Tefilla, as opposed to Musaf, which anyway, you don't say it that often. Musaf is only randomly, it's only unusual occasions, and therefore the Musaf has in it the carbon Musaf. But the way I'm understanding it is that since Shachris and Mincha need to be available for someone to daven to express any particular need they may have, therefore it cannot include the Parshas Tamid. By the way, the Shibbolei Aleket writes, in the name of Rabbi Binyamin, that the Kriya of Parshas Tamid is a chayva, and the proof is in the pudding. Because we don't say it in Shemona Esrei, like we mentioned the psukim of Musaf. You know why? Because in Musaf, we better say the psukim of Musaf, because we won't say it any other time. But since we're mechuyav to say the Parshas HaTamid, so that's why it's not in the Shachris. In other words, the fact that it's not in Shachris indicates that you're mechuyav to say it in the Korbanos. So let's just end off with a support to this chiddush of the Noid Yehuda. Noid Yehuda wants to say that the reason why we don't say the Parashas Hatamid in Shemona Esrei is because then the Shemona Esrei would not be appropriate for all time. The Mechaber tells us in Siman Memches we should say the Parashas Hatamid, and the psukim of Korban Shabbos on Shabbos we say near the Parashas Hatamid. Says Rama, Oimrim Parashas Hatamid. Let's say you didn't say the Tamid but let's say you cannot say the Tamid b'tzibur. You could say it at home. And say it again with the tzibur. And the second time, have in mind that you're just being kari b'Torah. So the question is, what do you mean the second time have in mind I'm being kari b'Torah? Why do I need to have anything in mind? So I said it a second time. What could be wrong with saying it a second time? So the Magen Avram says here, the Rama just writes that l'ravcha de milsa, so it's not like you're bringing the carbon tamid twice. Meaning we don't want anybody bringing the carbon tamid twice. So he says this hashkafa of the Rama, that we don't want someone bringing the carbon tamid twice, supports the chiddush of Noid Yehuda, who says the reason why the tamid is not in Shachris, even though the psukei musaf are in musaf, is because Chazal said, you need to, a person is able to daven all day. And since it's possible for a person to daven Shemona Esrei numerous times, now it comes out, if you're going to have the tamid in Shemona Esrei, we see there's a hakpada not to say the tamid more than once, because otherwise it looks like you're being makar of the tamid more than one time. So this supports the idea of the Noid Yehuda that the parsha of the Tamid, it would be sort of inappropriate for it to be in Shemona Esrei. Okay, Rabbi Sai, thank you everyone for listening. Wishing everyone a Freilichen Shabbos Parshas Pinchas. We should be Zoicha, Eliyahu, Yavai, V'yigalenu, B'mher V'yaminu, Amen. Agun Shabbos.
Rabbi?
Yes. Shabbos.
Why is it that when you say Korbanos in the morning,
Yeah.
you hear also the Yesesosenu of the
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.